My DNA test proved my grandson was not related to our family, and the worst part was that everyone already knew except me. I did not discover that truth in a laboratory or a lawyer's office. I discovered it at my own dining room table on a quiet Sunday evening, surrounded by the people I loved most. My name is Carolyn Mitchell. I was 70 years old, a retired elementary school teacher living outside Indianapolis, and until that night, I believed my family was the one thing in my life that had never betrayed me. The dinner started like dozens before it. My son David stood by the grill on the back patio, while my daughter-in-law Melissa carried bowls of potato salad into the kitchen. My grandson Ethan, now 20 years old, sat scrolling through his phone while pretending to listen to conversations. The smell of barbecue filled the air. Laughter drifted through the house. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied. I carried a manila envelope in my purse the entire evening. Nobody knew it was there. 3 weeks earlier, I had secretly submitted a DNA test. At first, I only wanted answers to a strange feeling I could never fully explain. There were small things over the years. Little comments, odd moments, tiny details that never quite fit together. I told myself I was imagining things. Then one casual remark from Ethan changed everything. A month earlier, he had joked that he looked more like a stranger than anyone in our family. Everyone laughed except Melissa. I noticed her face lose color for a split second. That expression stayed with me. It followed me home. It followed me to bed. Eventually, it followed me to a DNA testing website. When the results arrived, I opened them alone in my kitchen. I expected reassurance. Instead, I found a question mark hanging over 20 years of family history. For days I carried that secret by myself. I watched Melissa. I watched David. I watched Ethan. The more I observed them, the more I felt like I was standing outside my own life looking in through a window. That Sunday evening, I finally decided I could not carry it anymore. After dinner, everyone gathered around the dining room table for coffee and dessert. The conversation was light, comfortable, ordinary. My hands trembled slightly as I removed the envelope from my purse. Nobody noticed at first. Then I placed it in the center of the table. The room became quiet. Melissa looked at the envelope. David looked at Melissa. Ethan looked confused. I opened the folder and slid the DNA report onto the table. Nobody reached for it. Nobody asked what it was. Nobody looked surprised. That was the moment my heart truly broke. Not when I saw the results. Not when I began to suspect something was wrong. It happened when I realized every face around that table already understood what was written on those pages. Melissa lowered her eyes. David stared at the floor. Ethan looked back and forth between us. And suddenly I knew I was not uncovering one secret. I was uncovering 20 years of silence. The silence around that table felt heavier than any words that could have been spoken. I looked from one face to another, searching for confusion, shock, or even anger. Instead, I saw something far worse. I saw recognition. Melissa kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. David rubbed his hands together nervously. Even Ethan seemed uncomfortable, though it was clear he did not understand the full story. I suddenly felt like a stranger sitting among people I had known for decades. For 20 years, I believed we were a close family. We celebrated birthdays together. We spent Thanksgiving crowded around the same dining room table. We exchanged Christmas gifts, vacation photographs, and stories about our lives. Looking back, I could still see all those memories clearly. The problem was that I no longer knew which parts had been real. Finally, I broke the silence. How long have you known? My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Nobody answered immediately. Melissa looked toward David. David looked toward the floor. That exchange told me more than any words could. They had discussed this moment before. They had prepared for it. Just not with me. How long? I repeated. David exhaled slowly. Mom, it is complicated. I almost laughed. That phrase appears whenever someone wants to avoid the truth. No, I said quietly. It is probably very simple. You either knew or you did not. Ethan shifted in his chair and looked at his parents. What is going on? He asked. His confusion seemed genuine. For the first time that evening, I realized he might not be part of the deception. That thought gave me no comfort. If anything, it made the situation even stranger. Melissa finally spoke. Carolyn, we never wanted to hurt you. There it was. Another sentence people use when explaining decisions that caused years of pain. I folded my hands together and looked directly at her. Then why did you lie? Tears appeared in her eyes immediately. That reaction might have moved me on another day. Not that evening. Too many questions had been building for too many years. David leaned forward. Mom, please. Let us explain everything. The word everything caught my attention. Not this misunderstanding. Not this situation. Everything. The same word people use when they know the truth reaches much farther than the conversation currently allows. My heartbeat slowed. A strange clarity settled over me. I suddenly understood that the DNA report was not the real story. It was only the first loose thread. Somewhere behind it existed a much larger secret. One powerful enough to make my son and daughter-in-law keep silent for 2 decades. One powerful enough to change the way every family gathering now looked in my memory. I reached for the report and slid it back into the envelope. Then I looked at David and Melissa. Start from the beginning, I said. And this time, do not leave anything out. The expression that crossed David's face told me something before he ever opened his mouth. Whatever came next was going to be far worse than the DNA test. David stared at the table for so long that I began to wonder whether he would answer at all. Ethan looked increasingly confused. Melissa sat perfectly still, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. The silence felt endless. Finally, David spoke. Mom, before I tell you anything, you need to understand that Ethan has always been my son. His words landed strangely. Nobody had questioned that. Not until he chose to say it. The moment those words left his mouth, I knew we were moving closer to whatever truth everyone had been protecting. Ethan frowned. Dad, what does that even mean? David closed his eyes briefly. I had seen that expression before. He wore it as a teenager whenever he knew he had made a mistake and could not undo it. The difference was that this mistake seemed to stretch across 20 years. It means being family is more than biology, he said quietly. Ethan looked at him, then at Melissa, then at me. Nobody appeared comforted by the statement. I folded my hands together and waited. Over the years, teaching elementary school had taught me something valuable. When people are uncomfortable, silence often reveals more than questions. Eventually, David continued. When Melissa became pregnant, there were complications in our relationship. Melissa immediately lowered her head. David glanced at her before speaking again. We were going through a difficult period. We were young. We made mistakes. We nearly ended everything. I listened carefully. Every sentence felt like someone opening a door only an inch at a time. Then Ethan was born, David said, and we decided to stay together. The room became quiet again. Something still did not fit. If this was only about a struggling young couple, there would be no reason for a DNA test to create such panic. There would be no reason for 20 years of secrecy. You are leaving something out, I said calmly. David nodded. I know. Melissa finally looked up. Tears filled her eyes. We thought we were protecting everyone. There was that word again. Protecting. It seemed to be the favorite excuse of every person who had hidden something from me. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Can somebody please tell me what is happening? His voice cracked slightly. For the first time, I felt sorry for him. Whatever secret existed, he was trapped inside it just as much as I was. David looked at his son and seemed unable to speak. Melissa reached across the table and took Ethan's hand. The gesture was full of fear. Not guilt. Fear. That detail stayed with me. Then Melissa said something that changed the entire direction of the conversation. Ethan, there are things about your birth that you do not know. The room felt colder. Ethan pulled his hand away slowly. What things? Melissa opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked toward David again. It was obvious they had rehearsed this conversation many times in their minds. Yet now that the moment had arrived, neither seemed prepared. Then my eyes fell on an old photograph hanging on the wall. It had been taken shortly after Ethan was born. Standing beside Melissa in that picture was a woman I had not thought about in years. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. A hospital visit. A whispered argument in a hallway. A name I had completely forgotten. My heart began to race. Because for the first time, I realized this story might not begin with Melissa or David at all. The photograph pulled me backward 20 years in an instant. I remembered the day clearly now. Melissa had just given birth. The hospital room was crowded with flowers, balloons, and excited relatives. Everyone was celebrating Ethan's arrival. At least that was what I thought at the time. Standing beside Melissa in the photograph was a woman named Rachel Monroe. She had been Melissa's closest friend for years. I had not seen her in nearly 2 decades. The moment her face resurfaced in my memory, something inside me shifted. There had been tension in that hospital. I remembered hearing raised voices in a hallway while I carried coffee back to Melissa's room. When I rounded the corner, the conversation stopped immediately. Rachel looked upset. Melissa looked terrified. David looked exhausted. Back then, I assumed it was stress from a difficult delivery. Now I was no longer certain. "Rachel," I said quietly. The name seemed to freeze the room. Melissa's eyes widened. David looked away. Ethan stared at all of us. "Who is Rachel?" he asked. Nobody answered him. That silence told me everything I needed to know. Rachel mattered. Somehow, she sat at the center of this secret. Melissa covered her face with her hands. "Carolyn, please." I shook my head. "No, we are past that now. Tell me what Rachel has to do with this." David leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For several seconds, he looked like a man carrying a burden he could no longer hold. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded defeated. "Rachel was there from the beginning." Ethan frowned. "Beginning of what?" Again, nobody answered him directly. I felt anger rising inside me, but I forced myself to remain calm. Losing control would not help me understand the truth. "David," I said firmly, "your son deserves answers too." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at Ethan. "There were complications before you were born. Decisions were made. People got involved. And after you arrived, everyone agreed to keep certain things private." Ethan stared at him. "What things?" Melissa lowered her hands and wiped tears from her face. "Things we thought would protect our family." The explanation felt familiar because I had heard it all evening. Protecting the family. Protecting everyone. Yet somehow, those protections always seemed to require keeping me in the dark. I looked toward the photograph again. Rachel's smiling face seemed completely out of place now. Then another memory surfaced. A birthday party when Ethan was 5 years old. Rachel had attended. I remembered watching her from across the yard. She spent almost the entire afternoon with Ethan. At one point, I even joked that she seemed more attached to him than some relatives. The expression on Melissa's face afterwards suddenly made sense. My pulse quickened. I slowly turned back toward David. "Rachel did not just know the secret," I said. "She was part of it." David looked down at the table. Melissa began crying again. Ethan sat frozen in confusion. Then David whispered 7 words that changed everything. "Rachel is the reason Ethan exists today." For several seconds, nobody moved. Ethan looked from his father to his mother, as if he were waiting for someone to laugh and admit this had all been a misunderstanding. Nobody did. David stared at the table. Melissa wiped tears from her cheeks. I felt as though the room had tilted beneath me. "What do you mean she is the reason Ethan exists today?" I asked. My voice remained steady, but every part of me was preparing for another shock. David took a slow breath. 20 years ago, we were told we might never be able to have children naturally." Ethan's eyes widened. Melissa lowered her head again. "We spent years trying," David continued. "Doctor appointments, tests, consultations. Every time we thought we were getting closer, something else went wrong." I listened carefully. For the first time that evening, I heard genuine pain in his voice. Not guilt, not fear. Pain. "Rachel was Melissa's best friend," he said. "When things looked hopeless, she offered to help." My heart began to pound. Suddenly, pieces that never seemed important before started fitting together. Rachel's constant presence during the pregnancy, the unusual closeness between her and Ethan when he was young, the way Melissa always became uncomfortable whenever Rachel's name came up. "Help how?" Ethan asked quietly. Nobody wanted to answer him. Eventually, Melissa spoke. "Because she loved us." Tears rolled down her face again. "And because she wanted us to have the family we dreamed of." The room became silent. I could see Ethan trying to understand words that were only partially explained. I could see David searching for the right way to continue. Then he finally looked directly at his son. "Rachel played a much bigger role in your arrival than anyone ever told you." Ethan sat perfectly still. "Are you saying she was my mother?" The question struck the room like a bolt of lightning. Melissa immediately shook her head. "No, no, sweetheart. I am your mother." Her answer came so quickly that I believed it. Yet something still felt unfinished. Something important remained hidden. David leaned forward. "Melissa is your mother. That has never changed." Ethan released a breath. Melissa reached for his hand, but he did not take it. "Then why did Grandma's DNA test come back the way it did?" he asked. That question lingered in the air. It was the same question I needed answered. David and Melissa exchanged another glance. I was beginning to hate those looks. Entire conversations seemed to happen between them while the rest of us waited outside. Finally, Melissa stood and walked toward a cabinet near the kitchen. She opened a drawer and removed a small envelope. Her hands trembled as she carried it back to the table. I immediately recognized the expression on her face. It was the look of someone about to reveal the one secret they had protected above all others. She placed the envelope in front of Ethan. Then she looked at me. "The DNA test did not uncover the biggest lie," she whispered. "It only uncovered the door hiding it." None of us touched the envelope for several seconds. It sat in the center of the table like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Ethan stared at it. Melissa stared at it. David looked as though he wished he could go back 20 years and make different choices. Finally, Ethan reached forward and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and an older photograph. He picked up the photograph first. I leaned slightly closer. The image showed a much younger Melissa standing beside Rachel outside a medical building. Both women were smiling, but now that I looked carefully, there was something unusual about the picture. They looked relieved. Not happy. Relieved. Ethan turned the photograph over. A date was written on the back. It was taken only months before he was born. Then he unfolded the paper. His eyes moved across the page slowly. The color drained from his face. "I do not understand," he whispered. Melissa began crying again. David lowered his head. My heart pounded as I reached for the document. It was a legal agreement. The language was formal and difficult to read quickly, but one phrase immediately stood out. Gestational carrier. I read it again, then a third time. Suddenly, everything began falling into place. Rachel had not been Ethan's biological mother. She had not been Melissa's replacement. She had carried Ethan during the pregnancy because Melissa could not. The room felt strangely quiet as I absorbed the information. Ethan looked up from the paper. "Rachel carried me?" Melissa nodded. "Yes." Her voice trembled. "You were always ours. Always. But without Rachel, you would not be here." Ethan sat back in his chair, trying to process a truth he had never expected. I understood his confusion because I felt it too. Yet one question still remained. One very important question. If Rachel had only carried the pregnancy, why had the DNA results caused such panic? Why had everyone reacted as though a much larger secret had been exposed? The answer arrived the moment I asked it aloud. Melissa closed her eyes. David looked at her. Then he looked at me. "Because that is not the part we hid from you." A chill ran through me. Every time I thought I had reached the center of the story, another door appeared. Ethan looked equally stunned. "There is more?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Melissa reached into the envelope again and removed a second document. I had not even noticed it before. This one looked older. Much older. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges. She handed it directly to me. At the top was the logo of a fertility clinic that no longer existed. Beneath it were names. Melissa Mitchell, David Mitchell, Rachel Monroe. Then there was a fourth name, a name I had never seen before. My eyes stopped on it instantly. The name belonged to a man who was not David, a man who had somehow been connected to Ethan's birth from the very beginning. When I looked up, Melissa was staring at me with tears in her eyes. That is the name nobody was ever supposed to find. The name on the document was Andrew Keller. I had never heard it before in my life. Yet, judging by the reaction around the table, everyone else had. Ethan stared at the paper. "Who is Andrew Keller?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Melissa pressed her hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. David looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single evening. Finally, he spoke. "Andrew was a donor." Ethan frowned. "A donor?" David nodded slowly. "When we learned we could not have children the way we expected, we worked with a fertility clinic. We made choices we thought were private. We never imagined they would follow us 20 years into the future." I looked down at the document again. Suddenly, the DNA results made more sense. Yet at the same time, they created an entirely new set of questions. "If Andrew was a donor," I said carefully, "then why did everyone react like the DNA report exposed something terrible?" Melissa closed her eyes. "Because we never told anyone." The room fell silent again. Not family, not friends, not even Ethan. Ethan looked stunned. He stared at his parents as though he no longer recognized them. "You never told me?" he asked quietly. Melissa shook her head. Tears streamed down her face. "We were afraid." "Afraid of what?" Ethan asked. "That you would think you were not ours." David immediately leaned forward. "You are ours. You always have been." Ethan looked away. Then why keep it a secret? No one had a good answer. The truth was obvious. The secret had started small and grown larger every year. One uncomfortable conversation became a decade. A decade became two. Eventually, the lie became part of the family itself. I understood that. What I could not understand was why I had been excluded. How long have you known? I asked David. Since before Ethan was born, he admitted. I turned toward Melissa. And you? She nodded. The entire time. I felt a sharp sadness settle inside me. Not because of Andrew Keller. Not because of the fertility clinic. Those things happened long before my involvement. What hurt was realizing that 20 years of birthdays, holidays, graduations, and family gatherings had all taken place while everyone carefully protected a truth from me. Then Ethan asked a question none of us expected. Does Andrew know about me? David froze. Melissa looked horrified. The expression on their faces told me everything before a single word was spoken. My pulse quickened. Ethan noticed it too. He does know, does he not? David slowly lowered his head. Melissa began crying harder than before. And in that moment, I realized the secret donor was not simply a name on an old document. Somehow, Andrew Keller was still connected to this story. And whatever connection remained was the real reason everyone at that table had panicked when my DNA results arrived. No one spoke after Ethan asked that question. The silence itself became an answer. I watched David's face carefully. I had known my son for more than 40 years. I knew when he was worried. I knew when he was hiding something. And right then, he looked terrified. Ethan noticed it too. He knows about me. Ethan said again. This time as a statement rather than a question. Melissa covered her mouth with one hand. David finally nodded. Very slowly. Very reluctantly. Ethan leaned back in his chair as though the air had been knocked out of him. How, he asked. How could he possibly know? David rubbed his forehead. Because things changed a few years ago. My heart sank. There was always another layer. Every answer seemed to uncover a larger secret underneath it. Melissa wiped her eyes and stared at the table. About 6 years ago, genetic testing websites became popular. People started uploading DNA information online. Relatives began finding relatives they never knew existed. Ethan looked confused. I was beginning to understand. Someone found someone, I said quietly. David nodded. Yes. He looked toward his son. A woman contacted us. She said her family had discovered biological connections through a DNA database. One of those connections eventually led back to Andrew Keller. Ethan sat perfectly still. Melissa continued speaking. At first, we ignored it. We thought it would disappear. Then more information surfaced. Eventually, Andrew learned that a child had been born using his donation. I could see the pain on her face. Not because of Andrew himself. Because of the choices that followed. Did he contact you? Ethan asked. David nodded again. He did. Another silence filled the room. Ethan stared at his father. And you never told me? David looked devastated. We thought we were protecting you. I closed my eyes briefly. There was that word again. Protecting. It had become the theme of the evening. Every secret, every omission, every lie seemed to be wrapped in the same explanation. Yet all that protection had brought us to this moment. Ethan looked down at the old clinic document. So he knows I exist. Melissa nodded. Yes. Have you met him? Ethan asked. David hesitated. That hesitation frightened me more than the answer itself. Then he whispered, twice. Ethan's eyes widened. Mine probably did too. The room felt colder than before. Twice. Ethan repeated. David could barely meet his son's gaze. Only to understand the situation. Only to make sure there would never be confusion about who your parents were. Ethan laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. You mean while everyone else was deciding what I should know about my own life? No one argued with him because no one could. Then Melissa reached for another folder resting beside her chair. I had not noticed it before. She slowly placed it on the table. There is something else, she said. The moment those words left her mouth, I felt my stomach tighten. The folder looked newer than the other documents. Much newer. Melissa opened it and removed a recent photograph. She slid it across the table toward Ethan. He picked it up first. Then his face went completely pale. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at the photograph. Then he looked at Melissa. Then at David. Then back at the image again. I leaned forward and finally saw what had shaken him so deeply. The photograph showed a man standing beside two young adults. All three were smiling. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Then I noticed the resemblance. The young man on the left looked remarkably like Ethan. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same smile. My heart sank. Who are they? Ethan asked quietly. Melissa wiped her eyes. Andrew's children. The room became completely silent. Ethan continued staring at the photograph. I have siblings. Melissa nodded slowly. Biological half-siblings. No one spoke for several moments. 20 years of secrets had finally reached their destination. There was no larger mystery hiding behind another door. There was only the truth. David looked at his son. We were afraid that if you learned about them, you would feel disconnected from us. Ethan laughed softly, but this time the sound carried sadness rather than anger. Instead, you made sure I learned everything at once. Nobody argued because he was right. Melissa reached across the table. This time, Ethan allowed her to take his hand. You were never anything less than our son, she said. Not for a second. Tears filled her eyes again. Every decision we made came from love. We just made some of those decisions out of fear too. I listened quietly. For the first time all evening, I began to see the full picture. There had been no affair, no hidden second family, no malicious deception. There had only been people making complicated choices and then allowing those choices to become lifelong secrets. The damage came not from the truth itself, but from the silence surrounding it. Ethan looked down at the photograph once more. Then he folded it carefully and placed it back on the table. I am still your son, he said to David. And you are still my father. David immediately nodded, unable to speak through his emotions. But I deserve to know. The words settled over the room. Simple, honest, impossible to argue with. I found myself nodding as well, because that sentence applied to more than Ethan. It applied to me too. For 20 years, everyone had tried to protect everyone else. In the process, they had forgotten something important. People deserve the truth about their own lives, even when that truth is difficult, especially when it is difficult. As the evening slowly came to an end, the atmosphere felt different. Not lighter exactly. The wounds were still fresh. The conversations were not finished. There would be more questions tomorrow, and perhaps many more after that. Yet something fundamental had changed. The secrets were gone. The burden of carrying them had finally been lifted. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone at the same dining room table where the evening had begun. The DNA report remained in front of me. I picked it up one final time. Weeks earlier, I thought it contained the biggest discovery of my life. Now I understood it had merely opened a door. The real discovery was not about genetics. It was about honesty, about trust, about how easily fear can grow when people stop telling the truth. And as I looked around the quiet house, I realized something unexpected. The DNA test had not destroyed my family. It had finally given us a chance to stop pretending and start being one.